Here are some facts about me. I killed my commander along with his son. I killed the one who saved me. My lover died, so I punished the doctor. All facts are truth. I am Alexander the Great, King of Macedonia and conqueror of one of the largest empires in history, stretching from Greece to Egypt and into India. I am ashamed of some things, and some things almost destroyed me. However, it is an integral part of my life. It proves that famous people have the same problems and life challenges as everyone else. Now all about it in more detail. Section 1, I killed my commander along with his son. Parmenion and Philotas. Two names I never wanted to be associated with death. Yet, as a ruler and military leader, I had to make decisions that would shape the future of my empire, and some of those decisions would weigh heavily on my conscience. In 330 BC, I faced one of the most difficult choices of my life, one that ultimately led to the execution of Parmenion, my trusted general, and his son Philotas. The events surrounding their deaths were complicated and full of political intrigue, but the result was the same. Two men I had once relied on were gone, and their executions marked a turning point in my reign. Parmenion had been with my father, King Philip II, for many years, and he had earned his place as one of the most respected generals in Macedonian history. He was a military strategist, a seasoned warrior, and a man who had seen countless battles. I had known him all my life, and in many ways, he was like a father figure to me. He had been instrumental in the victories that paved the way for my own campaigns, and I owed much of my early success to his guidance and leadership. But, despite our long and storied relationship, Parmenion's fate was sealed the moment his son, Philotas, was accused of treason. Philotas, my one-time friend and companion, had been a trusted officer in my army. But when news reached me that he had conspired with others to assassinate me, everything changed. The allegations were grave, and there was no room for doubt in my mind that treason could not go unpunished. As a ruler, I had to make an example of those who would dare betray me, no matter how close they had been. The idea of betrayal was anathema to everything I stood for, and I could not allow it to threaten the stability of my empire. Philotas was arrested, and after a trial, he was found guilty. The sentence was swift. Philotas was executed, and with his death came the inevitable question: what should be done about his father, Parmenion? It was not a decision I took lightly. Parmenion was a man of immense influence, and I had relied on his military expertise for much of my campaign. But the accusations against Philotas had cast a shadow over our relationship, and I could not afford to show any signs of weakness. If I spared Parmenion, it might signal to my enemies that I was merciful, that I was unwilling to act decisively in matters of treason. And if I allowed him to live, there would always be the lingering doubt that he might have been complicit in his son's plot. I had to make the painful decision to order Parmenion's execution. It was not easy. I had trusted him, and he had been loyal to me and to my father. But in the world of politics and power, loyalty could be a double-edged sword. I could not afford to be sentimental. I could not afford to be weak. Parmenion's death, though necessary in my mind, would haunt me for the rest of my life. The decision was made for the sake of the empire, for the sake of my future, but the personal cost was immense. I had lost a father figure, a trusted ally, and a man whose counsel I had once sought. And in doing so, I had opened the door to questions about my own ability to make difficult decisions without the burden of guilt. The execution of Parmenion and Philotas is often seen as a turning point in my reign. Some have argued that it marked the beginning of my descent into a more ruthless and dictatorial form of leadership. Perhaps they are right. The line between political necessity and personal tragedy is a fine one, and I sometimes wonder whether I crossed it that day. The deaths of Philotas and Parmenion weighed heavily on my heart. They were not just two men lost to me, they were two reminders of the human cost of power. In the years following their deaths, I often reflected on the consequences of my decision. Could I have handled the situation differently? Could I have spared them, or at least spared Parmenion, who had been loyal to me for so long? The answer, I know, is complicated. There were forces at play that I could not control. My enemies were constantly watching, waiting for any sign of weakness, and I could not afford to show any hesitation. If I had allowed Parmenion to live, it might have emboldened those who sought to undermine me. But in my heart, I knew that I had lost something in the process. I had lost a piece of my humanity, a piece of my soul. The decision to execute Parmenion and Philotas is one that I have often been criticized for. Historians and scholars have debated whether it was the right choice, whether it was a necessary act of political calculation or a tragic mistake. But for me, it is a decision that will never be fully resolved. I will never know if I made the right call. What I do know is that, in that moment, I made the decision I thought was best for my empire and for my legacy. Looking back on those years, I realized that power came with a price. The weight of leadership was a heavy burden to carry, and the decisions I had to make were often more difficult than any battle I had fought on the field. The executions of Parmenion and Philotas were just one example of the tough choices I had to face. But they were also a reminder of the personal sacrifices that came with ruling an empire. Sometimes, the price of power is more than just the lives of others, it is the price of your own peace of mind, your own soul. As I continue to reflect on my reign and the choices I made, I know that I will never escape the memory of that day. The deaths of Parmenion and Philotas are part of my legacy, a legacy that is both triumphant and tragic. They remind me that power, while necessary, can also be isolating, and that even the greatest rulers must face the consequences of their actions. Section 2, I killed the one who saved me. Clitus the Black. He was one of my closest companions, a general who had fought beside me through countless battles, and a man whose loyalty was unquestionable. We shared a bond that was forged in the heat of war, a bond that, for me, symbolized the strength and unity of my army. But, in one of the darkest moments of my reign, I ended up killing Clitus, the very man who had once saved my life. It happened in 328 BC, during a banquet in the city of Marikanda, now known as Samarkand. It was an act of anger, rashness, and deep regret, one that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Clitus had saved me on the battlefield at the Battle of the Granicus River. It was in that fight that I had nearly lost my life, struck by a Persian spear, when Clitus rushed to my side, pulling me from the enemy's grasp. He saved me when my own courage nearly failed. He was a man of immense bravery, and it was his actions that allowed me to survive and continue my quest for empire. In the years that followed, Clitus became one of my most trusted generals, someone who had been with me from the beginning of my conquests. But as time went on, our relationship began to shift, and what once was a bond of mutual respect began to fray. The tension between Clitus and me grew during the period when I began to adopt Persian customs and integrate aspects of Persian culture into my rule. I had always been fascinated by the East and its traditions, and as I expanded my empire, I wanted to bring together the best of both Macedonian and Persian cultures. I encouraged my men to marry Persian women, wore Persian clothing, and even adopted Persian rituals in court. I believed that this fusion of cultures was essential for the future of the empire, a way to unite the diverse peoples I had conquered. But to men like Clitus, this was a betrayal of everything we had fought for, a rejection of the traditions that had made Macedonia great. Clitus could not stand what he saw as my abandonment of our Macedonian roots. One evening, during a feast, he spoke out in anger. His voice was loud and cutting, accusing me of forsaking the values that had made us strong. He criticized me for adopting the ways of the Persians, for bowing to their kingly practices, and for even taking on the title of King of Kings, a title that had long been associated with Persian rulers. Clitus's words stung, but they were not entirely unjust. He was a man of conviction, and I knew he spoke from a place of deep loyalty to the traditions that had brought us success. But in that moment, his criticism was like a spark that set off a fire within me. The alcohol at the banquet had loosened my tongue and clouded my judgment. I had always been passionate, but that night, the combination of frustration, anger, and alcohol brought out the worst in me. The weight of Clitus's accusations crushed me, and I lashed out in a way that I would never have imagined possible. I rose from my seat in a fit of rage and, without thinking, grabbed a spear and hurled it at Clitus. The blow struck him, and he fell to the ground. The room went silent, and for a moment, I stood there, stunned by what I had just done. But the damage was done. Clitus, the man who had saved my life, was dead, killed by my own hand. At first, I felt a strange sense of relief, as if I had somehow rid myself of the burden of his criticism. But that feeling quickly faded, replaced by an overwhelming wave of guilt and horror. I had killed Clitus, someone I had loved like a brother. The realization of what I had done hit me with full force, and I could barely comprehend it. I had killed a loyal servant of my empire, a man who had been by my side for years. The man who had saved my life was now gone, and I was the one who had taken it. The grief that followed was unbearable. I tried to justify my actions to myself. I told myself that Clitus had been wrong, that his criticism was unfounded and that he had no right to speak to me that way. I told myself that I had been acting in the heat of the moment, that the alcohol had clouded my judgment. But deep down, I knew the truth. I had killed him in a fit of rage, and that act of violence had forever changed me. I had lost a part of myself that night, my sense of honor, my sense of leadership, and, above all, my sense of brotherhood. The aftermath of Clitus's death was filled with deep sorrow and regret. The men who had witnessed the killing were shocked, and many of them were deeply disturbed by what had happened. It was a moment of weakness for me, a moment where I failed to live up to the ideals of leadership that I had set for myself. I had always prided myself on my ability to inspire loyalty and respect in others, but that night, I had shattered that image. I had killed a man who had been nothing but loyal to me, and in doing so, I had shown the world my own vulnerability, my own humanity. The grief I felt after Clitus's death was intense, and I could not escape it. I spent days in deep sorrow, regretting my actions, questioning my decisions, and reflecting on the consequences of my anger. I even fell into a state of depression, unable to move past the loss. I had become a ruler who had lost his way, and I knew that the repercussions of my actions would follow me for the rest of my life. Clitus's death was a turning point in my reign, a moment that would define the way I was remembered. Many saw it as the act of a madman, a ruler who had allowed his emotions and insecurities to dictate his actions. But for me, it was a tragic reminder of the consequences of unchecked rage, of the dangers of being unable to control one's emotions in the face of criticism and doubt. I had killed a friend, a general, a man who had been loyal to me when I needed him most. And no matter how much I regretted it, that fact would never change. As I continued my campaigns and sought to expand my empire, the memory of Clitus's death remained with me. It was a weight I could never fully shake, and in some ways, it shaped the man I would become. The death of Clitus, like so many other events in my life, was a harsh reminder that power comes at a cost, that leadership is not just about conquering lands but about mastering oneself. I had conquered many kingdoms, but in the end, I had failed to conquer my own rage. Section 3. The strained relationship with his father. My relationship with my father, Philip II, was complicated and, at times, strained. From an early age, I was aware of the immense power he wielded. He had built an empire, united Greece, and secured Macedonia's position as a formidable force in the ancient world. However, beneath the surface of admiration and duty, there were deep currents of tension that shaped my view of him and our relationship. Philip was a king, a conqueror, and a master strategist, but he was also a man of great ambition and strong desires. His actions often had a profound impact on those closest to him, especially me. The most significant moment of conflict came when Philip married Cleopatra Eurydice, a noblewoman from Macedonia. Cleopatra's marriage to Philip was not just a political alliance but a move that threatened my own claim to the throne. In Macedonian tradition, succession to the throne was not solely determined by birthright, it was also about political favor and the alliances one could forge. When Cleopatra gave birth to a son, a legitimate Macedonian heir, it sent a clear message to me: my position as the future king was no longer certain. I had always been his son, and in my youth, I had revered him as a father should be revered. I had fought alongside him in numerous battles, learning the art of warfare and strategy. Yet, as Philip's relationship with Cleopatra grew more serious, so did my fears and insecurities about my future. I felt betrayed by the man I once called my mentor, my father. He had never truly consulted me about his plans for succession or considered how his actions would affect my position. It wasn't just a matter of inheritance, it was about respect and trust, which were severely undermined in my eyes. Olympias, my mother, felt this betrayal keenly as well. She had been married to Philip first, and although she had been sidelined in many ways, the marriage to Cleopatra brought everything to a head. Olympias and Philip had a strained marriage, but this new union felt like a personal affront to both of us. My mother's anger was palpable, and in a moment of desperation, we fled to Epirus, a kingdom to the west of Macedonia, hoping to distance ourselves from the growing tensions at court. The situation was unbearable for me. I was a prince, a warrior, but I was also a son who had been sidelined by my father's political maneuvering. We lived in Epirus for a time, uncertain of what the future held. My mind was a swirl of conflicting emotions: betrayal, anger, fear. It was during this period of exile that I began to question not only my father's decisions but also my own future. I had been raised to lead, to conquer, and yet I felt displaced in a world where my rightful place was being taken from me. In the end, the relationship between Philip and me would never be repaired. I could not reconcile the Philip who had been a father and a teacher with the man who had made decisions that jeopardized my future. The tensions were only exacerbated by the political landscape of the time. My position as heir was no longer secure, and I could not ignore the reality that Cleopatra's son stood in the way of my own claim to the throne. In 336 BC, Philip was assassinated during a wedding celebration, leaving the kingdom in turmoil. The circumstances surrounding his death remain unclear, but many believe that it was orchestrated by those within his own court, possibly with the involvement of Cleopatra and her family. I did not mourn his death as one might mourn the loss of a father. There was no deep sense of grief, only a mixture of relief and guilt. Relief that I was now the undisputed king of Macedonia, but guilt because I knew I had never fully made peace with him, and his death had left many things unresolved between us. Despite the assassination, the bitterness between us remained. I had always respected Philip's military genius, but our relationship had been marked by deep wounds that never healed. The succession of the throne, the political betrayal, and the fractured family ties all left scars that would remain with me throughout my reign. While I was able to claim the title of king and continue my father's conquest of Persia, the complexities of my relationship with him never truly faded. It was a relationship defined by power struggles, ambition, and a sense of abandonment, and it shaped much of who I became as a ruler. As I continued my campaign eastward, I could not help but carry the burden of my father's legacy and the unresolved issues between us. His death allowed me to step into the role of king, but it also left me with a deep sense of unfinished business. My reign, filled with conquests and battles, was in many ways an attempt to prove myself, to prove that I was worthy of the throne that had once seemed out of reach. But I could never fully escape the shadow of my father, nor the unresolved tensions that had marked our relationship. Looking back, I realized that the conflict with my father, the strained relationship, and the political machinations that surrounded it were pivotal moments in my life. They shaped my view of power, loyalty, and succession, and they influenced the way I ruled. My relationship with Philip was complex and fraught with tension, but it was also formative. It taught me the hard lesson that in the world of kings and empires, loyalty is often conditional, and the bonds between father and son are no different from the alliances that bind kingdoms. My reign would be defined by my own decisions, but the influence of Philip's actions, and our strained relationship, would follow me throughout my life. Section 4, My lover died, so I punished the doctor. My death came swiftly, too swiftly for a man of my ambitions. At 32, I had no time to plan for what came next. In the years before my passing, I had conquered lands stretching from Greece to Egypt, from Persia to India, and yet I had not prepared a future for the empire I had built. This failure, my failure, would become the source of great turmoil for those who followed. My young son, Alexander IV, was barely more than an infant when I died. He was not ready to rule, no one expected him to be. And Aridaeus, my half-brother, though more mature, was mentally incapable of leading. In the chaos that followed my death, neither could hold the reins of the vast empire I had created. They were not the leaders needed to hold the fractured pieces together. For years, I had believed that my conquests and the strength of my army would keep the empire intact. But I failed to account for the importance of a clear succession, the stability that comes with it, and the ability to manage the fractured loyalties of the generals who served me. I thought my generals, my trusted companions in arms, would maintain the unity of my empire. But I was wrong. In the final years of my life, I did not leave a system to ensure that my vision would be carried forward. I had not named a successor definitively. I left no strong heir who could unite the various factions of my empire under one rule. Instead, I left behind a vacuum. A vacuum of power that quickly turned into a battlefield. The wars of the Diadochi were inevitable. My generals, men like Ptolemy, Seleucus, Antigonus, and Perdiccas, each believed they had the right to rule, and they were willing to spill blood for it. These men had fought by my side, but once I was gone, they turned on one another, each believing they were the true heir to my empire. They divided my lands amongst themselves, ruling over their respective territories with growing autonomy. There was no longer a single unified empire, but a collection of kingdoms, all with their own ambitions, all fighting for power. Ptolemy took Egypt, Seleucus seized the eastern provinces, and Antigonus sought to rule over much of Asia Minor. Meanwhile, my mother Olympias, ever ambitious and calculating, sought to place my son, Alexander IV, on the throne, though he could never wield the power of his father. She tried to consolidate her influence, but she was caught up in the bloodshed that followed. She ultimately lost her life in the chaos that erupted. The empire I had built, an empire forged through battle, blood, and sweat, was torn apart by the very men who had once been loyal to me. And what of my son, the rightful heir? He never had the chance to grow into his role. He was little more than a pawn, caught in the struggle for power. Eventually, he and his mother were both murdered, part of the cruel cycle of revenge and ambition that followed my death. What could I have done differently? I had achieved so much, victory after victory, creating an empire that had never been seen before. But in the end, I failed to secure its future. I failed to establish a clear plan for succession, a system that could ensure stability in the face of my death. My legacy, instead of being one of unity and strength, became a tale of division and conflict. Had I lived longer, I might have found a way to settle these disputes. Perhaps I could have chosen a worthy successor, someone who could hold the empire together. Perhaps I could have created a lasting institution, a governing body that would guide the empire through the challenges of succession. But I didn't. I was too focused on the next conquest, on expanding the empire beyond its limits, and in doing so, I overlooked the internal structure that would keep it together. The bloodshed that followed my death was not just the result of rivalry and ambition. It was the result of my own failure to see the bigger picture. I had spent my life building an empire, but I had never thought to build the systems that would keep it intact. The wars that followed, these wars of the Diadochi, tore apart my family and my empire. They took the lives of men who had been like brothers to me, and they destroyed the dreams of a unified kingdom. In the end, the empire was never the same. It fractured into pieces, and what I had built was no longer the great unified force I had imagined. My empire, my legacy, was diminished. The violence that erupted in the wake of my death was a tragic reminder of my own shortcomings. My failure to establish a clear succession plan became the undoing of everything I had worked for. Now, I can only hope that my actions, my conquests, my vision, though scattered and lost in the aftermath, will be remembered. Perhaps it will be remembered as a cautionary tale, a lesson in the importance of foresight and the cost of neglecting to secure the future. In the end, it was not the wars I fought on the battlefield that destroyed my empire, it was the battle for power that came after my death, a battle that I failed to prepare for. What a legacy I left behind! What a waste!